We believe that some books must be challenged. This critique uses, as appropriate, a step-by-step critical thinking framework that maps claims to evidence.
We also apply an intellectual framework, and we use the Golden Rule and the U.S. preamble to identify ethical asymmetries.
And we'll conclude with a logical analysis and a balanced conclusion.
Absolutely.
The book we're diving into today is Paul D. Miller's The Religion of American Greatness. And right from the start, with David French's foreword, it's clear this book is meant for serious internal conservative debate.
Which is exactly what we intend to give it.
And the central tension is just fascinating. Why would a deeply patriotic conservative argue that the very pursuit of American greatness could actually be, well, a theological and a civic threat?
It's a question that really demands a rational approach, not just a reactive one.
And to help you navigate this very dense topic, you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for a deeper, more dynamic book critique.
Our goal here is to get past the political caricatures and really analyze the structure of Miller's claims for you.
Okay, let's start with the heart of it all. Miller's definition of the core conflict. He argues that what he calls the religion of American greatness.
Which is his term for a certain kind of Christian nationalism.
Right. He argues that this is fundamentally an illiberal political theory.
And illiberal is a key word there. He doesn't just mean it's a political preference he dislikes. He's saying it's a worldview that actually undermines our shared constitutional norms.
So how does he define Christian nationalism, then, to make that claim stick?
Well, he sees it as the belief that there's a distinct American nation that must remain normatively Christian.
Normatively Christian in what sense? In culture? In law?
Both. In its culture and in its laws. And in this view, the government's job is to preserve that one specific religious cultural template.
Which, he argues, turns the Christian faith into a kind of a political identity project.
A trigal marker, yes. And he contends that's just incompatible with the pluralistic American constitutional experiment.
So, if the problem is defining the nation by this narrow religious culture, what's the alternative? What's the positive vision Miller offers?
His counterclaim is that American identity should be creedal, not ethnocultural.
Creedal, that's a crucial concept. What does he mean by that exactly?
It means an identity rooted in universal principles, ideas available to anyone no matter their background or what church they attend, if any.
So we're talking about the core ideas in, say, the Declaration of Independence.
Exactly. Equality under the law, ordered liberty, pluralism. That's the creed.
So he's not arguing from a secular progressive position at all. He's positioning himself as a patriotic conservative trying to rescue two things at once.
That's it. He wants to save both the historic commitment to liberal democracy and the integrity of Christian orthodoxy.
Both of which he thinks are being corrupted by this fusion of God and country.
Right. And what's really compelling is the descriptive part of his argument. He does some very strong historical work reconstructing how American Christians have repeatedly merged their faith with a national identity.
He traces this all the way from early forms of civil religion.
Things like national days of prayer back in the 19th century.
Right up to the contemporary Christian Re.
And he shows how that merger, which might start as just simple patriotism, slowly morphs into something else.
Into more of a culture war project.
Yes, a project aimed at protecting our culture, very narrowly defined, from what are seen as demographic and ideological threats. It shifts from loving your country to feeling you must dominate your country.
And that's where he brings in the theology.
This is his most critical move. He engages with the biblical use of the word nations and argues that applying the special covenant God gave to ancient Israel.
A covenant tied to a specific land, a specific history.
Applying that to modern America is a fundamental category mistake. Theologically, he says, the church is universal, not national. You just can't square that circle with basic Christian doctrine.
Okay, so this is where we have to start testing his arguments. Let's map these claims to the evidence and, more importantly, to the counter-arguments.
And there is significant pushback from critics.
I was going to say, a lot of critics argue he overstates his case, that he makes Christian nationalism sound like this coherent, unified movement when it might be more amorphous.
They raise a powerful methodological concern. They suggest Miller relies too much on broad sociological categories, on these typologies, and on general warnings about illiberalism.
Instead of what? What do they want to see?
They feel he needs to slow down and show, case by case, where a specific policy advocated by a self-identified Christian nationalist actually violates a constitutional norm or a scriptural teaching.
Rather than just pointing to a general philosophical danger.
Exactly.
But couldn't you argue that misses the forest for the trees? If the movement's goal is to change the philosophy behind the Constitution, then focusing only on individual policies might be missing the point.
That's a valid challenge. I think the critics' deeper point is often about Miller's starting premise.
Which is?
That he treats liberal democracy itself as a non-negotiable, almost sacred norm for Christians, without really demonstrating why it's the only form of government required or preferred by the Christian faith.
It's treated more as an assumed good than a justified conclusion.
Precisely. And that opens up the whole ethical dimension.
It does. Let's move into that. Let's apply the golden rule, treat others as you'd wish to be treated, to Miller's core suspicion about privileging one religious group in law and culture.
And that suspicion is ethically weighty. I mean, any political order designed to treat non-Christians as permanent outsiders or as second-class citizens just fails that basic test of reciprocity.
Of course, if you, the listener, were in the minority, you wouldn't want the majority's beliefs systematically privileged across every institution.
And this idea resonates so clearly with the U.S. preamble, specifically the goal to establish justice and ensure domestic tranquility.
Because religious tribalism, almost by definition, erodes that domestic tranquility.
It generates fear, resentment, a zero-sum conflict. It makes shared citizenship almost impossible. It's a recipe for instability.
But critics jump on Miller's ethical solution, don't they? This idea of governmental cultural neutrality.
They do. They see it as ethically underspecified, maybe even a bit naive.
It's a powerful critique. How can any state be truly morally serious? How can it legislate on things like family or education or bioethics without implicitly privileging some vision of the good life over others?
Complete neutrality just seems like a philosophical fiction.
So, applying an Adler-style question here, does Miller's framework fully honor the legitimate loves of a political community, its particular history, its traditions?
While still guarding against that domination and exclusion? That's the balancing act. Does his model protect the ability of these thick religious communities to pass on their beliefs without pressure from the state to just conform?
It's so easy to get lost in the academic side of this, but these arguments are about people's deepest fears and identities. This seems like a good time for a mindful moment.
It is. We have to step back and just acknowledge the real fears driving all sides of this debate. Rational reflection can only begin when we understand the motivation.
So, on one side, you have this palpable fear of cultural erasure. Christian nationalists fear moral collapse and being marginalized in institutions they feel they helped build.
They feel their way of life is slipping away, and that loss is what they see for their children. It's a very potent fear.
And on Miller's side, the fear is just as profound. He fears the corrosion of liberal norms, the betrayal of Christian universality, and this slide towards, what does he call it, illiberal majoritarianism.
Where the majority feels it has the right to use state power to enforce its will on everyone else without any constitutional restraint.
And rational reflection really begins when you, the listener, can acknowledge that both sets of fears have plausible roots in real experience. They aren't just fabricated.
They are deeply felt, even if the proposed remedies are deeply contestable.
Our YouTube channel, Mindful Moments, is all about creating space for this kind of reflection. We offer AI book analysis, summaries, critiques, and podcasts to inspire rational thought instead of just reaction.
The book really is an opportunity to ask a different question, not which tribe wins, but what would it mean to genuinely love my neighbor and even my political opponent within a shared constitutional order?
Okay, let's turn to logical consistency. Where is Miller at his most coherent?
He's at his most logically consistent when he exposes that category error we talked about earlier, when he shows how some versions of Christian nationalism treat the church's mission as just a means to an end.
The end being national greatness.
Exactly. They are, in effect, instrumentalizing Jesus for a culture war project. The church becomes a tool.
Not the universal body of believers with its own distinct and non-political mission.
Precisely. His insistence that the church is universal, that it can't be collapsed into one nation's destiny, is a very clear and coherent theological boundary. It's a check against baptizing any one party or nation as God's nation.
But the logical critiques against him suggest he commits his own kind of category error.
They do. They argue that by so sharply separating creed from culture, he creates a different problem.
What is the problem?
Well, by defining this pure, abstract creed that's divorced from any specific history, he risks flattening the very cultural context, the Anglo Protestant context he wants to move away from, that actually gave American constitutionalism its shape in the first place.
You can't just separate the ideas from the history of the people who developed them.
You can't. And critics also point out his use of terminology. They say he sometimes uses the word illiberal as a kind of trump card, an argument ender.
Rather than an examined conclusion he arrives at after a patient investigation.
Exactly. And we have to note the political context. David French's name on the book reinforces its commitment to pluralism, which is a strength. But it also places the book squarely within a very heated intra-conservative fight.
So some readers will see it not as a neutral analysis, but as just another faction's version of civil religion.
Inevitably.
So let's wrap this up. What is the ultimate value of the religion of American greatness?
As a piece of critical political theology, it is a serious conservative critique of Christian nationalism. That makes it invaluable for any reader who holds traditional Christian convictions, but is also worried about the moral costs of fusing faith with nation.
Its portrait of Christian nationalism as both theologically distorting, making God too small, and civically destabilizing is forceful.
It is. It's powerful and demands attention, even if its own proposed solution, a kind of neutral, liberal, civic religion, leaves some really important questions unanswered about tradition and history.
Ethically, the book aligns very strongly with the Golden Rule and the preamble's spirit. It warns against creating hierarchies of belonging.
It urges Christians to treat their pluralistic neighbors as genuine fellow citizens, not just as obstacles to power. Intellectually, it deserves to be engaged with by everyone, supporters and critics of Christian nationalism alike.
So it's not the final word.
Not at all. It's a rigorous, necessary prompt for deeper reasoning, a prompt for all of us to think about what a just, ordered, and genuinely neighbor-loving public life might actually require in a diverse republic.
And as an addendum, this critique draws on a systematic critical thinking framework informed by contemporary work on argument analysis, intellectual virtues, and ethical evaluation in public discourse, adapted specifically for book-length argument evaluation.
That framework emphasizes careful reconstruction of claims, evidence, and assumptions, followed by ethical testing and logical appraisal to help you, the reader, practice rational judgment rather than passive consumption. Click the link on screen for the in-depth book analysis.
Subscribe, share, purchase via the link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.